Tánaiste Leo Varadkar, Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment, thank you for joining me on my very first show presenting on Newstalk. A lot of the people that will listen to the show, they'll be decision makers, business leaders, managers, entrepreneurs, people who care about the economy. They will, of course, welcome the fact that the economy has rebounded very quickly after the nasty pandemic, which, of course, took so many lives. But they're very nervous about rising prices, Tánaiste. They're very worried about how they're going to afford to run their business when they can't see at the end to the price rise spiral. What advice would you have for them?
First of all, thanks very much for having me on your programme. It's an honour to be on the first show and hope it's going to be a great success. And as it is St. Bridget's Day, I'd just like to say Lá Éile Bríde Honna Díobh to all of your listeners, and pleased that from this time next year, the first Monday in February, as you know, will be our new public holiday, bringing us up to 10, which is more in line with the European average, still slightly below, but closer to it. Like, to answer your question, like everyone, I'm really pleased at the fact that the economy has rebounded so quickly, that the public finances are in good order, and that we're back up to 2.4 million or more people at work. We didn't think, well, I suppose back last summer I would have said that the economy was going to take off like a rocket. Didn't quite think, but my prediction would be as close to the mark as it was. But that's not me saying for a second that I think that everything is rosy in the garden. There are certainly vulnerabilities ahead, and one of those is inflation. And as your listeners will know, there's lots of reasons for that. Most of them factors well beyond our control, such as international energy prices and supply chains being disrupted, and also a huge bounce back in demand. There was a lot of suppressed demand during the pandemic that has now come back in the form of real demand. So that's really the underlying cause for inflation. Everyone, including the Irish government, expects that inflation to moderate in 2022, but it certainly won't go into reverse. So we'll continue to see pressures on prices over the course of the year. And I suppose we as a government have to think about what we can do to try and help with that.
You are talking about doing something with the living wage. I know a lot of the employers and managers and HRM officials will be watching that very careful. Is there a risk that, the dreaded phrase, a wage price spiral? You and I are too young to remember the 1970s when that was very real in this country and in other countries, and it all ended very badly, an almost bankrupt economy. So tell us what you're going to do about this living wage situation.
Okay, well, first of all, I think it's important to say that we have a national minimum wage in Ireland, and that is one of the highest in the world, about sixth in the developed world, if you like. But when you actually adjust for purchasing power parity, what you can actually buy with it, it's actually now around the same or a bit lower than the minimum wage in Britain, and that's unusual. We typically would have wages that are higher than in Britain. So the Low Pay Commission recommended a 3% increase, signed the order for that last year. That now kicked in January. But a 3% increase is actually less than prices are rising. Yeah. So far from a wage inflation spiral, it could be argued that where we are at the moment is actually the reverse, that wages are rising slower than prices are, and that would be true in the public service as well. 2% pay increase this year, when prices are rising by 5%. So I don't think that's where we are at the moment by any means. We're seeing inflation outside of certain parts of the private sector. We're not seeing the minimum wage, public sector pay, or social welfare or pensions going up as fast as inflation are. So the big problem from a political point of view is that this is causing an enormous squeeze on household budgets, that people are struggling to pay the bills, and particularly those in lower incomes are having to make very difficult decisions, perhaps choosing between energy and groceries, which is an awful position for anyone to be in. I think from a business point of view, where the squeeze is really being felt is on issues like energy prices. Yeah. Everyone's seeing those gas and electricity bills going up a lot. And also there is pressure in large parts of the private sector around wages. But that is one of the areas that we're trying to help with, obviously, with the employment wage subsidy.
There's only so much you can do on energy prices, given a lot of those prices are set globally, Tánaiste. But Ireland is an expensive place to live and to do business. I mean, I've lived in Germany, in Belgium, the Netherlands, the UK, and I think it feels like more expensive than all of those countries in this country. Well,
it is more expensive, and the higher cost of living and the higher cost of doing business is also reflected in the fact that we've higher wages and businesses charge more for their products and services. So, there is a connection between prices and costs. And somebody may ask a question: why is it cheaper to go to a restaurant in Spain? Why is it cheaper to get this service in Germany? And that's a reflection of the fact that business prices and the prices that businesses charge often reflect their underlying costs.
Yeah. You're trying to make life better for a lot of people. You're adding St. Bridget's Day. This year it'll be on the 18th of March, but next year it will be 1st of February. An extra bank holiday. You're looking at redundancy payments. We've spoken about the living wage. We've spoken about the work. We're going to speak about the working from home. I just wonder whether we're moving away from the traditional benchmarks of an economy, which would be GDP, which is money, and more towards the holistic quality of life benchmark. And how should employers prepare themselves for that new world, if that is what you're aiming for, Tánaiste?
Well, I should say, as Minister, I've set out three main priorities. One is to help businesses get through Brexit and COVID to survive and prosper again. The second is to get to the point where there are 2.5 million people that work in Ireland by 2024. So that would be setting new records in terms of employment levels.
You're at 2.4 now?
We're at 2.4 now, but some of that is distorted by EWIS and the pandemic unemployment payments. So sure, we may see a drop before we see it rise again. But on the back of the best ever EI and IDA results last year, and a recovering construction sector, for example, and an expanding public service and growing economy, I think we can get there to that 2.5 million at some point in 2024, and that's the aim. And then the other aim, the third aim, if you like, is to improve terms and conditions for workers. And I think that's actually in the interest of business, because huge numbers of business people say to me that they're struggling to attract staff and struggling to retain staff. And part of solving that problem is actually going to be better terms and conditions for staff. But I'm very aware that businesses have to make a profit, and we can't go too fast or too far with some of these changes. If I often say the most important workers' right is the right to work, and if you go too far too fast and people end up having their hours cut or people end up having to be laid off, then you're not actually achieving anything. And I'm very conscious of that and very aware of that. But the thing you mentioned there about GDP, I've never been one of these people who thought that GDP was the be-all and the end-all of everything. I'm a politician, and when I talk to people knocking on doors or just out and about around my constituency, what they're interested in, to the extent they're interested in statistical markers at all, it's things like, for example, what's the unemployment rate? And that's always been important. It's not that it was only ever all about GDP. How are we doing in terms of living standards? Our average income's rising. So I've never bought into this idea that there was ever a time when it was all about GDP, and we're now moving towards something different, which is a more holistic measure. And of course, we've had those holistic measures. We have the Gini coefficient, which is a marker of inequality. We have the UN Human Development Index, which Ireland does very well in, which takes into account GDP, life expectancy, and educational attainment. So we've always had lots of indicators beyond GDP. And I suppose I don't accept the view that it was ever all about GDP, but I've always felt
you get that countries benchmark themselves against GDP, and they say, well, what's your GDP per head, which is not really a fair analysis of this economy. Some people say GNI per head is a much better one, or GNP.
But even that's imperfect.
Even that's imperfect. I was just wondering whether we're moving toward a world whereby you value quality of life. Not that you can, measure it, but
you can try, and you'll know that New Zealand has an index of wellness and well-being. Bhutan does as well, to give an example at the other end. And we have a project in government to do exactly that, to develop a well-being and wellness indicator for Ireland. And I'm a big supporter of that project. But I'm also a realist around statistics as well, and there will be always people who will disagree with what weighting you give certain indicators, or even how they're calculated. If anyone's interested in reading a book, little small book, one really worth reading, and it's a biography of GDP. Little book you'd read in a few hours, but it's actually fascinating to see where GDP even came from, and how flawed it is. But actually, you could say that for any indicator, including, no doubt, whatever well-being index we settle on.
And I'll add it to my bedtime reading. Tánaiste, you spoke to my colleague Pat Kenny last week about remote working from home. And you've got cabinet approval, and you're going to proceed. Of course, there's a few hoops that employees will have to go through, and employers to a certain extent. Are there plans to create an independent body to assess whether employers are asking too much and rejecting too easily, or whether employees are being unreasonable in demanding working from home?
Well, I should say at the outset, I'm a big fan of remote working and hybrid working and home working. It's good for families that people have a bit more flexibility around where they work. I think it can be very good in terms of rural and regional development to get more people working in remote hubs in small towns and villages. And my basic view is that employers should facilitate it and should be willing to do so, provided the business gets done and provided that the services that are provided to the public aren't diminished in any way. And that would be my kind of benchmark as to whether people should be allowed to work remotely or work from home. And during the pandemic, it was a requirement. As much as possible after the pandemic, I want it to be a choice. But we also need to be realistic. It can't be an absolute right. There's lots of jobs that can't be done remotely. Construction, most of retail, most hospitality, you name it. There's lots of others I could add to that list. And there's some things that you could do remotely, but they wouldn't be done as well. And then service users would lose out. So we need to be realistic about that.
An independent body?
The independent body exists already. It's the Workplace Relations Commission. So the way the new right to request remote working is going to work is that the person can make their request. Now, bear in mind, some people have it in their contract already and might negotiate it as a change to their contract. Mm-hmm. This is for people who don't have any contractual right or any legal right at all to remote working. They would then request it, and their employer has an obligation to respond within 12 weeks. We'll look at shortening that, but it'll be something in around 12 weeks, and must give a reasoned response. They can't just say no. They must give a reasoned response. The answer can be yes, the answer can be no, or the answer can be something in between, which is, a counter offer, as they call it. And if it's the case that the employee isn't satisfied, they can then either appeal internally if there's an internal appeals mechanism, or they can make a complaint to the Workplace Relations Commission, which will then be able to adjudicate on that. Now, it won't be a case of the Workplace Relations Commission going into a business and telling you how to run your business, but they will be able to say that if the refusal is manifestly unfair, that it needs to be reconsidered. But ultimately, people do need to be able to run their businesses. So it is going to be a qualified right, not an absolute right. It is a right to request, not a right to demand. Mm-hmm. And one thing that is in the legislation, which I think is actually very positive, is there will be a requirement for every employer to have a remote working policy. Now, that might be very short, it might be only a few pages. We'll produce templates and codes of practice to help employers do that. But that will avoid, I think, very many cases going to the Workplace Relations Commission at all. Because if you've got a clear policy in your workplace as to when you do and don't allow hybrid working and remote working, well, then all you have to do is follow your own policy. And I think there'll be a sensible approach to this. I often say people have the right to annual leave, for example. 2 million people exercise that right every year. How many cases go to the WRC? Very few, because people know the law and they know the rules. Same thing might apply to maternity leave, for example. So it's rare enough that somebody has to go to WRC because, generally speaking, employers and employees are willing to work together and be flexible and sensible around these things. And particularly in a moment when it's very hard to get staff, I think most sensible employers will want to facilitate employees in order to hold on to them.
Tánaiste, why do Irish borrowers, companies and individuals, pay the highest borrowing rates in Europe when it's all the single currency? Why do mortgage holders in this country pay 3 times what they do in Luxembourg? And I know this is something that Pascal Donoghue is looking at, but this is an outrageous difference in prices between Luxembourg and this country.
Well, we do expect that gap to narrow, and you'll be aware of some of the new players in the market that have come in, and they're offering mortgages at lower rates.
But 2 big ones are leaving.
Yeah, and the question is, why are they leaving? And why are banks leaving Ireland? There's a narrative that Ireland is a great place for banks and insurance companies to make money, and it's some sort of treasure island. If that was the case, why would insurance companies be pulling out of Ireland? Why would banks be leaving Ireland? And the truth is, when it comes to banking, they have much higher capital requirements. Mm-hmm. So a Belgian bank or a German bank, if it decides to write a loan or write a mortgage in Ireland, it has to set aside more capital, more reserves than it would if it was writing the same loan to a Belgian in Belgium or a German in Germany. And that is down, unfortunately, to the fact that we've had a history of higher default on our loans than those countries have. And there's lots of reasons for that.
And can you lean on the regulator to change the capital requirements so that there would be changes to the borrowing requirements?
Well, you have to be very careful about leaning on regulators, of course, because they are independent, but we certainly have these discussions.
Huge influence.
With the central bank and of course with the ECB and the single regulatory mechanism, and a lot of these things are done at European level. And what they would say back to us is that the high capital requirements are there in Ireland because of a historic high level of default, for better or for worse. In other countries, defaults are less common and repossessions happen a lot quicker.
Yeah.
In our culture, we don't want that. We hate to see people having their business or their farm or their home repossessed.
But if
for
they
very
haven't
good
paid
reasons.
a mortgage repayment in a year or two, shouldn't they lose their property?
Well, it depends on the circumstances. You can't not pay your debts forever, but nobody likes to see somebody losing a farm that's been in the family for years. Nobody likes to see anyone evicted into homelessness, for example, and that does happen. But the fact that we have forbearance in Ireland in a way that doesn't exist in less caring countries in many ways has a social cost, and that social cost can arrive in the form of higher interest rates and can arrive in the form of it being harder to get credit. But that doesn't mean we do nothing about it. So one of the things we've done as a government, for example, is we've a lot of government-backed business loans now. So people will know about all the loan guarantees, the future growth loan scheme. They'll know about the Brexit impact loan scheme. Maybe as much, certainly a couple of months ago, as much as a quarter of all lending to business was government backed in some way. Mm-hmm. That's the small and medium enterprises. And because we've given those partial loan guarantees as a government, that's enabled businesses to get loans at lower rates than they would have otherwise and for longer terms. And one thing that I hear from business now is that they are able to get credit in a way that was not the case, if you remember back during the financial crisis 10 years ago when there's a real squeeze. And then when it comes to helping people who are looking to get a mortgage, we have the local authority loan product, which replaced the Rebuilding Ireland loan product. And these didn't exist at all a few years ago. And that's a government-backed mortgage, which helps people to essentially get a mortgage at a lower interest rate than they otherwise would.
Superb. Thank you, Tánaiste, for joining us on Newstalk today.
Thank you.